The War of the Worlds is an episode of the American radio drama anthology series The Mercury Theatre on the Air. It was performed as a Halloween episode of the series on Sunday, October 30, 1938, and aired over the Columbia Broadcasting System radio network. Directed and narrated by actor and future filmmaker Orson Welles, the episode was an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds. It became famous for allegedly causing mass panic, although the reality of the panic is disputed as the program had relatively few listeners. The first two-thirds of the one-hour broadcast was presented as a series of simulated news bulletins, which suggested an actual alien invasion by Martians was currently in progress. The illusion of realism was furthered because the Mercury Theatre on the Air was a sustaining show without commercial interruptions, and the first break in the program came almost 30 minutes into the broadcast. Popular legend holds that some of the radio audience may have been listening to Edgar Bergen and tuned into The War of the Worlds during a musical interlude, thereby missing the clear introduction that the show was a drama, but recent research suggests this only happened in rare instances. In the days following the adaptation, there was widespread outrage in the media. The program's news bulletin format was described as deceptive by some newspapers and public figures, leading to an outcry against the perpetrators of the broadcast and calls for regulation by the Federal Communications Commission. The episode secured Wells's fame as a dramatist. Production. H.G. Wells' original novel tells the story of an alien invasion of Earth. The novel was adapted by Howard E. Koch for the 17th episode of the CBS radio series The Mercury Theatre on the Air, broadcast at 8 p.m. Est on Sunday, October 30, 1938. The program's format was a simulated live newscast of developing events. The setting was switched from 19th-century England to contemporary Grover's Mill, an unincorporated village in West Windsor Township, New Jersey in the United States. The first two-thirds of the hour-long play is a contemporary retelling of events of the novel, presented as news bulletins interrupting another program. I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening, Wells later said, and would be broadcast in such a dramatized form as to appear to be a real event taking place at the time, rather than a mere radio play. This approach was similar to Ronald Knox's radio hoax broadcasting The Barricades, about a riot overtaking London, that was broadcast by the BBC in 1926, which Wells later said gave him the idea for The War of the Worlds, a 1927 drama aired by Adelaide Station 5CL depicted an invasion of Australia via the same techniques and inspired reactions similar to those of the Wells broadcast. He was also influenced by the Columbia Workshop presentations The Fall of the City, a 1937 radio play in which Wells played the role of an omniscient announcer, and Air.It, a vibrant as-it-happens drama starring Ray Collins that aired October 27, 1938. Wells had previously used a newscast format for Julius Caesar, with H.V. Kaltenborn providing historical commentary throughout the story. The War of the Worlds broadcast used techniques similar to those of the March of Time, the CBS News documentary and dramatization radio series. Wells was a member of the program's regular cast, having first performed on the March of Time in March 1935. The Mercury Theatre on the Air and the March of Time shared many cast members, as well as sound effects chief Ora D. Nichols. Wells discussed his fake newscast idea with producer John Houseman and assistant director Paul Stewart. Together they decided to adapt a work of science fiction, They considered adapting M.P. Shields' The Purple Cloud and Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World before purchasing the radio rights to The War of the Worlds. Houseman later wrote that he suspected Welles had never read it. Howard Koch had written the first drafts for the Mercury Theatre broadcasts Hell on Ice, 17, and Around the World in 80 Days. Monday, October 24, he was assigned to re-script The War of the Worlds for broadcast the following Sunday night. Tuesday night, 36 hours before rehearsals were to begin, Koch telephoned Houseman in what the producer characterized as deep distress. Koch said he could not make The War of the Worlds interesting or credible as a radio play, a conviction echoed by his secretary Anne Frolick, a typist and aspiring writer that Houseman had hired to assist him. With only his own abandoned script for Lorna Doone to fall back on, Houseman told Koch to continue adapting the Welles fantasy. He joined Koch and Frolick and they worked on the script throughout the night. On Wednesday night the first draft was finished on schedule. On Thursday, associate producer Paul Stewart held a cast reading of the script, with Koch and Houseman making necessary changes. That afternoon, Stewart made an acetate recording, with no music or sound effects. Welles, immersed in rehearsing the Mercury stage production of Danton's Death scheduled to open the following week, played the record at an editorial meeting that night in his suite at the St. Regis Hotel. After hearing Air.It on the Columbia Workshop earlier that same evening, Welles viewed the script as dull. He stressed the importance of inserting news flashes and eyewitness accounts into the script to create a sense of urgency and excitement. Houseman, Koch and Stewart reworked the script that night, increasing the number of news bulletins and using the names of real places and people whenever possible. Friday afternoon the script was sent to Davidson Taylor, executive producer for CBS, and the network legal department. The response was that the script was too credible and its realism had to be toned down, as using the names of actual institutions could be actionable. CBS insisted upon some 28 changes in phrasing. Under protest and with a deep sense of grievance, we changed the hotel built-in more to a non-existent Park Plaza, Transamerica to Intercontinent, the Columbia Broadcasting Building to Broadcasting Building, Houseman wrote. The United States Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., was changed to the Government Weather Bureau, Princeton University Observatory to Princeton Observatory, McGill University to Macmillan University, New Jersey National Guard to State Militia, United States Signal Corps to Signal Corps, Langley Field to Langham Field, and St. Patrick's Cathedral to the Cathedral. On Saturday, Stewart rehearsed the show with the sound effects team, giving special attention to crowd scenes, the echo of cannon fire and the sound of the boat horns in New York Harbor. Early Sunday afternoon, Bernard Herrmann and his orchestra arrived in the studio, where Welles had taken over production of that evening's program. To create the role of reporter Carl Phillips, actor Frank Redick went to the record library and played the recording of Herbert Morrison's radio report of the Hindenburg disaster over and over, working with Bernard Herrmann and the orchestra that had to sound like a dance band fell to Paul Stewart, the person Welles would later credit as being largely responsible for the quality of The War of the Worlds broadcast. Welles wanted the music to play for unbearably long stretches of time. The studio's emergency fill-in, a solo piano playing Debussy and Chopin, was heard several times. As it played on and on, Houseman wrote, its effect became increasingly sinister, a thin band of suspense stretched almost beyond endurance. That piano was the neatest trick of the show. Dress rehearsal was scheduled for 6 p. a.m. Our actual broadcasting time, from the first mention of the meteorites to the fall of New York City, was less than 40 minutes, wrote Houseman. During that time men traveled long distances, large bodies of troops were mobilized, cabinet meetings were held, savage battles fought on land and in the air, and millions of people accepted it, emotionally if not logically. The cast of characters of the War of the Worlds appears in order as first heard in the broadcast. Announcer, Dan Seymour. Narrator, Orson Welles. First studio announcer, Paul Stewart. Meridian Room announcer, William Allen. Reporter, Carl Phillips. Frank Readick. Professor Richard Pearson. Orson Welles. Second studio announcer, Carl Frank. Mr. Wilmoth, Ray Collins. Policeman at Wilmoth Farm, Kenny Delmer. Brigadier General Montgomery Smith, Richard Wilson. Mr. Harry MacDonald, Vice President in charge of radio operations, Ray Collins. Captain Lancing of the Signal Corps, Kenny Delmer. Third studio announcer, Paul Stewart. Secretary of the Interior, Kenny Delmer. 22nd Field Artillery Officer, Richard Wilson. Field Artillery Gunner, William Allen. Field Artillery Observer, Stephen Schnabel. Lieutenant Vote Bombing Commander, Howard Smith. Bayonne Radio Operator, Kenny Delmer. Langham Field Radio Operator, Richard Wilson. Newark Radio Operator, William Hertz. 2x2L Radio Operator, Frank Readick. 8x3R Radio Operator, William Hertz. Fourth studio announcer, from roof of broadcasting building, Ray Collins. Fascist stranger, Carl Frank. Himself, Orson Welles. Broadcast. Plot summary. The War of the Worlds begins with a paraphrase of the beginning of the novel, updated to contemporary times. The announcer introduces Orson Welles. We know now that in the early years of the 20th century this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about the various concerns they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacence people went to and fro over the earth about the little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small spinning fragment of solar driftwood which by chance a design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space. Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects vast, cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew the plants against us. In the 39th year of the 20th century came the great disillusionment. It was near the end of October. Business was better. The war scare was over. More men were back at work. Sales were picking up. On this particular evening, October 30th, the Crossley service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radios. The program continues with the weather report and an ordinary dance band remote featuring Ramon Raccolo and his orchestra, interrupted by news flashes about strange explosions on Mars. An interview is arranged with reporter Carl Phillips and Princeton-based professor of astronomy Richard Pearson, who dismisses speculation about life on Mars. The news grows more frequent and increasingly ominous as a cylindrical meteorite lands in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. A crowd gathers at the site where Phillips and Pearson relate the events. The cylinder grows, and onlookers catch a glimpse of a tentacled, pulsating, barely mobile Martian inside before it incinerates the crowd with heat rays. Phillips's shouts about incoming flames are cut off mid-sentence. Regular programming breaks down as the studio struggles with casualty and firefighting updates. A shaken Pearson speculates about Martian technology. The New Jersey State Militia declares martial law and attacks the cylinder. A captain from the field headquarters lectures about the overwhelming force of properly equipped infantry and the helplessness of the Martians, until a tripod rises from the pit. The tripod obliterates the militia, and the studio returns, now describing the Martians as an invading army. Emergency response bulletins give way to damage and evacuation reports as thousands of refugees clog the roads. 3 Martian tripods from the cylinder destroy power stations and uproot bridges and railroads, reinforced by 3 others from a second cylinder that landed in the Great Swamp near Morristown. As gas explosions continue, the Secretary of the Interior addresses the nation. A live connection is established to a field artillery battery in the Watchung Mountains. Its gun crew damages a machine, resulting in a release of black smoke before fading into the sound of coughing. The lead plane of a wing of bombers from Langham Field broadcasts its approach and remains on the air as their engines are burned by the heat ray, and the plane dives on the invaders. Radio operators go active and fall silent. Although the bombers destroyed 1 machine, the remaining 5 are spreading black smoke across the Jezreel marshes into Newark. Eventually, a news reporter, broadcasting from atop the broadcasting building, describes the Martian invasion of New York City. 5 great machines wading the Hudson, like wading through a brook. Black smoke drifting over the city, people diving into the East River like rats, others in Times Square falling like flies. He reads a final bulletin stating that Martian cylinders have fallen all over the country, and is eventually killed by the smoke. Finally, a ham radio operator is heard calling 2X2L calling CQ, New York. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone? After a period of silence comes the voice of announcer Dan Seymour. You are listening to a CBS presentation of Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre of the Air, in an original dramatization of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The performance will continue after a brief intermission. The last third of the program is a monologue and dialogue. Professor Pearson, having survived the attack on Grover's Mill, attempts to make contact with other humans. In Newark, he encounters an opportunistic militiaman who holds fascist ideals in regards to man's relationship with the Martians, and intends to use Martian weaponry to take control of both species. Declaring that he wants no part of his world, Pearson leaves the stranger with his delusions. His journey takes him to the ruins of New York, where he discovers that the Martians have died. As with the novel, they fell victim to earthly pathogenic germs, to which they had no immunity. Life eventually returns to normal, and Pearson finishes writing his recollections of the invasion and its aftermath. After the play, Wells assumes his role as host and tells listeners that the broadcast was a Halloween concoction. The equivalent, he says, of dressing up in a sheet, jumping out of a bush and saying, "Boo." Popular mythology holds this disclaimer was hastily added to the broadcast at the insistence of CBS executives as they became aware of panic inspired by the program. In fact, at the station break, network executive Davidson Taylor attempted to prevent Wells, who had added the speech at the last minute, from reading it on air, because it could have opened the network up to legal liability, but Wells delivered it anyway. Announcements. Radio programming charts in Sunday newspapers listed the CBS drama, The War of the Worlds. The New York Times for October 30, 1938, also included the show in its leading events of the week, and published a photograph of Wells with some of the Mercury players, captioned, Tonight's show is H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Announcements that The War of the Worlds is a dramatization of a work of fiction were made on the full CBS network at 4 points during the broadcast October 30, 1938, at the beginning, before the middle break, after the middle break, and at the end. The middle break was delayed 10 minutes to accommodate the dramatic content. Another announcement was repeated on the full CBS network that same evening at 10:30 p.m., 11:30 p.m., and midnight. For those listeners who tuned in to Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre on the air broadcast from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight and did not realize that the program was merely a modernized adaptation of H.G. Wells' famous novel War of the Worlds, we're repeating the fact which was made clear 4 times on the program, that, while the names of some American cities were used, as in all novels and dramatizations, the entire story and all of its incidents were fictitious.